Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be looking at something that I think is going to be super useful for everybody, especially with some recent events. We're going to be talking about E. coli, and specifically how to recognize the symptoms of an E. coli infection. We're going to be using some really great information from the CDC, and we also have some expert medical advice to help us unpack all of it.
This is really timely information for anyone listening, especially parents. E. coli outbreaks do happen and they can be pretty scary. So the more we understand about the symptoms and what to watch out for, the better prepared we'll all be.
Exactly. And with that recent thing with McDonald's and the Quarter Pounders, I know a lot of people are feeling a little anxious about E. coli right now. So let's just dive right into it. Maybe we could start with just a quick overview of E. coli. What is it exactly?
Sure. So E. coli stands for Escherichia coli. And it's actually a type of bacteria that normally lives in our intestines. And believe it or not, most types of E. coli are completely harmless. In fact, they actually help with digestion.
Oh, wow. So it's not always a bad thing.
Exactly. It's a bit of a misconception that all E. coli is bad. But there are certain types that can cause illness, and those are the ones we're going to be focusing on today.
Okay, that makes sense. So if we're talking about the types of E. coli that cause illness, what are we looking out for? What are the symptoms?
Well, the most common symptoms are things like stomach cramps, which can be very severe, and diarrhea. And with the diarrhea, it can be either watery or bloody. That's definitely something to pay close attention to. Some people might also experience vomiting or have a low-grade fever.
Ugh, yeah. None of that sounds pleasant at all. Now,
Yeah.
let's say somebody thinks they might have been exposed to E. coli. How long does it typically take for those symptoms to show up?
Usually, there's an incubation period of about 3 to 4 days after you've been exposed to the bacteria before you start feeling sick. So you might not know right away that something's wrong.
Oh, so you can be going about your day, feeling totally fine, and then all of a sudden, bam, you get hit with those symptoms.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be aware of how those symptoms can progress. At first you might just have some mild stomach discomfort, maybe a little diarrhea. But as the infection progresses, things can get a lot worse.
Okay, so what does that progression look like? What should people be watching out for?
Well, the diarrhea can become more frequent and more severe. You might also develop a higher fever, and you can start to feel really dehydrated.
Yeah, dehydration is something that I've always been a little bit nervous about,
Yeah,
especially with kids. It can get serious pretty quickly, right?
absolutely. Especially in young children, dehydration can escalate very quickly. So it's really crucial to recognize the signs early on.
What are those signs? What should parents specifically be looking out for?
So keep an eye out for infrequent urination or if their urine is very dark. Also, if your child seems excessively thirsty, has a dry mouth, or isn't producing tears when they're crying, those are all potential signs of dehydration.
And for adults, are the signs pretty much the same?
Yeah, they are. In addition to what I just mentioned, adults might also feel dizzy or lightheaded if they're dehydrated.
Okay, so it sounds like the key here is to really pay attention to those early signs and not just brush them off as, a simple stomach bug or something.
Exactly. It's always better to err on the side of caution, especially when it comes to E. coli. If you're at all concerned or if those symptoms are severe, it's always best to contact your doctor.
Now, we've talked about the initial symptoms and how those symptoms might progress. Let's talk about when it's absolutely crucial to get medical help. What are the red flags that people should never ignore?
All right, so definitely if you're experiencing diarrhea or vomiting that lasts for more than 2 days, if you see blood in your stool or urine, or if you have a fever that's higher than 102 degrees Fahrenheit, those are all signs that you need to see a doctor right away.
Okay, so 2 days of those symptoms, that's a big red flag.
Absolutely.
And what about those dehydration signs we talked about earlier? Are those also serious enough to warrant a doctor's visit?
Definitely. Don't hesitate to seek medical help if you or your child is showing signs of dehydration.
It's always better to be safe than sorry, right?
Exactly.
Now, I know we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to go back to a specific type of E. coli called Shiga toxin-producing E. coli, or STAC for short.
Right.
You mentioned that it can lead to some pretty serious complications. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So STAC produces a toxin that can sometimes trigger a condition called hemolytic uremic syndrome, or HUS for short.
HUS, okay.
Yeah.
I've heard of that, but to be honest, I'm not really sure what it is.
So HUS can be very serious. It affects the kidneys, and in some cases, it can even lead to kidney failure.
Wow, okay, so we're not just talking about a simple stomach bug here. With
Hmm.
STAC, there's a potential for much more serious health problems.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to seek medical attention immediately if you suspect you might have a STEC infection.
Okay, so what are some of the signs of HUS that people should be aware of?
So look out for things like decreased urination, pale skin, any unexplained bruising or tiny red spots, and blood in the urine. You might also notice extreme fatigue or irritability, and in some cases, even decreased alertness.
Okay, so it's really important to be vigilant and not just ignore any unusual symptoms, especially after a potential E. coli exposure.
Exactly. Early detection and treatment are key when it comes to HUS.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here today. We've talked about the common symptoms of an E. coli infection, how those symptoms can progress, and when it's crucial to seek medical attention. Before we move on, I just want to emphasize that the information we're sharing today is for general knowledge purposes only, and it should not be taken as a substitute for professional medical advice. If you have any concerns about E. coli or your health in general, please talk to your doctor.
I absolutely agree. Your doctor is your best resource for personalized medical guidance.
Now, let's take a closer look at STEC, that specific type of E. coli that can cause HUS. We'll discuss how it spreads, the risks involved, and some preventative measures you can take to protect yourself and your family.
Yeah, so when we talk about SEC, it's often spread through contaminated food.
Okay, so what kind of food are we talking about here? Like, what should people be especially careful about?
Well, undercooked ground beef is a big one. You also want to be careful with things like unpasteurized milk and juices. And even contaminated fruits and vegetables can be a source.
So basically just being really mindful about what you're eating and where it's coming from.
Exactly. And when it comes to food preparation, there are actually some really simple but effective steps you can take to minimize the risk.
Okay, give us the expert tips. What should we be doing in the kitchen?
Well, first and foremost, always cook your meat thoroughly. Make sure it reaches a safe internal temperature. You know a meat thermometer is your best friend.
I love my meat thermometer. Seriously, I use it for everything.
Good. You're already ahead of the game then. Another important tip is to really wash your fruits and vegetables carefully, even if you plan on peeling them. You just never know what might have come into contact with the surface.
Right, that makes sense. And I'm assuming cross-contamination is a big no-no, like using the same cutting board for raw meat and then veggies without washing it in between.
Absolutely. That's a recipe for disaster. Always use separate cutting boards and utensils for raw meat and produce. And of course, wash your hands thoroughly with soap and water after handling raw meat and before you eat.
Those are all really good reminders, even for someone like me who thinks they're pretty good about food safety.
Yeah,
It's easy to get a little complacent sometimes.
yeah, you're right. It's all about staying vigilant and building those good habits into your routine.
Now, I know we've been focusing a lot on cystec because it can cause those more serious complications, but are there other types of E. coli that people should be aware of?
Yeah, there are a few others that can cause diarrhea, although they're typically less severe than STEC. One example is enterotoxigenic E. coli, or ETEC.
E-tech. Okay, I've never heard of that one. What's that all about?
ETEC is often associated with traveler's diarrhea.
Oh, that makes sense. So if you're traveling to certain parts of the world, you might be more at risk.
Right. It's commonly spread through contaminated food and water,
Yeah.
especially in developing countries where sanitation standards might not be as strict.
So if you're planning a trip abroad, it's extra important to be careful about what you're eating and drinking.
Absolutely.
Mm-mm.
Bottled water is your friend in those situations. And be cautious about street food or anything that might not have been prepared under the most hygienic conditions.
Good advice. Any other types of E. coli we should be aware of?
There's also enteroaggregative E. coli, or EAEC, and that one is known for causing persistent diarrhea, especially in children.
Persistent diarrhea. Oh my gosh, that sounds terrible,
Mm.
especially for little kids.
It can be. It's just another reason to really practice good hygiene and food safety habits, both at home and when you're traveling.
Okay, so we've talked about those most common types of E. coli that can cause illness. We've talked about the symptoms, the risks, and some ways to protect ourselves. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something we touched on a bit earlier, that recent E. coli outbreak linked to McDonald's Quarter Pounders. Any updates on that? I know we're focusing on the bigger picture of E. coli here, but I think people are still curious about what happened there.
Yeah, the CBC has been actively investigating that outbreak, and as of today, they're reporting 75 cases across 13 states. The investigation is still ongoing, but they believe the contamination likely originated from a common ingredient, possibly the onions used on the Quarter Pounders.
Oh, wow. So it sounds like they're making progress in identifying the source.
They are. And thankfully, McDonald's has taken proactive steps to address the situation. They've temporarily stopped using fresh onions and have switched to a different beef patty supplier in those affected states.
Oh, okay, so that's reassuring to hear. It shows they're taking it seriously and trying to protect their customers.
Yes, and they've been cooperating fully with the CDC's investigation. It's important to note, though, that they haven't definitively confirmed the source of the contamination yet, but the investigation is moving in the right direction.
Okay, so it sounds like we'll just have to stay tuned for further updates from the CDC. But in the meantime, what's the key takeaway for our listeners?
Well, the key takeaway here is that while outbreaks like this can be concerning, the vast majority of E. coli cases are preventable. By following those basic food safety guidelines we talked about earlier, you can significantly reduce your risk of infection, regardless of what's happening in the news.
That's a great point. It can feel kind of overwhelming when you hear about these outbreaks, but remembering that we actually have the power to protect ourselves is really empowering.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to our health.
Well said. Now, before we move on to our final thoughts, is there anything else you'd like to add about the McDonald's situation or E. coli prevention in general?
No, I think we've covered the McDonald's thing pretty well, and you've given us some really great tips on how to prevent those E. coli infections. But before we wrap up, I'd love to hear your final thoughts. What's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
You know, for me, what I really want to emphasize is that knowledge is truly our best defense. The more we understand about E. coli, its symptoms, how it spreads, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions about our health and protect ourselves and our families.
Yeah, and it's funny. I think when people hear E. coli, they automatically think, oh, food poisoning is it. But we kind of forget that there's a lot more to the story, right? Not all E. coli is bad. And even the ones that are, there are things we can do to minimize our risk. That's such a good point. We tend to focus on the negative. But understanding that our bodies actually rely on certain types of E. coli for healthy digestion, it puts things into perspective. It's about having that balanced view.
Exactly. It's not about living in fear of every burger or every salad we eat. It's about being informed, taking those sensible precautions, and recognizing those red flags when they do pop up.
Well said. And remember, if you ever have any doubts or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to your doctor. They're there to guide you and provide that personalized advice.
Couldn't agree more. Well, this has been an incredibly informative deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you feel empowered to make those informed choices about your health. Remember, stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay healthy. Until next time on The Deep Dive.